A forgotten hollow. A mother's twisted scripture. A marriage that defied God and nature. For decades, the mountains kept their secret, guarded by silence and shrouded in mist. But when a midwife hears a dying woman's confession, she uncovers a truth so vile it demands a voice. This is the story of the Inbred twins, the Unmarked Graves, and the daughter who refused to let the mountains bury her mother's quest for justice. There in the Appalachian Mountains of 1890, a terrifying case was discovered. The case of inbred twins, bound to one another in a twisted marriage. This was the grim truth a midwife stumbled upon when she arrived in a forgotten hollow. Two brothers, connected not just by blood, but by a perverse ceremony their own mother had forced upon them. It was God's will, she taught them. A sacred duty, she said, to keep their bloodline pure, yet their unholy union was not where the horror ended. Across their property, scattered like fallen leaves, small graves lay unmarked. Children born of the very same blood, dying before their first breath could even be drawn. The town knew. In shadows, they whispered about it. But when one woman dared to speak the truth aloud, she fell from a ravine. Or perhaps, she was pushed. Now, her daughter has returned, asking the very same dangerous questions. How many children died within that cursed hollow? And why would an entire community choose silence over saving innocent lives? Like a shroud, the mountain mist clung to the hollow. Inside a one-room cabin, in the flickering candlelight, Elizabeth May Collins pressed her hands against a laboring woman's swollen belly, feeling the child's desperate struggle to enter a world that seemed determined to reject it. The young mother, unmarried and barely 18, had been in agony for nearly 12 hours, her pale face slick with sweat, her eyes rolling back in delirium. Difficult births Ellie had seen before, during her training in Charleston. But here, in the remote hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, death seemed to hover closer, waiting with the patience of a predator. "Please," the girl gasped, her fingers clawing at the rough wool blankets. "It has to come now, please." Her voice cracked. Then, as another contraction seized her, she began to speak in fragments, her words tumbling out like stones down a mountainside. "The Blackwood twins? Oh, Lord, the Blackwood twins. A sin against God, it is. A child born of the same blood." The girl's eyes rolled, wild and unfocused. Yet her grip on Ellie's wrist was fierce. Same blood. Same blood. Same blood. Ellie's hand stilled for a moment, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the cabin's loose boards. Something dark in her memory was stirred by the Blackwood name. Her mother's voice echoed across the years, carrying warnings about families who kept too much to themselves, about an unnatural closeness that defied God's design. But her mother was 7 years dead now, fallen from Miller's Ravine on a foggy morning while Ellie was away studying midwifery. The circumstances of that fall had never sat right in Ellie's mind. Too convenient it seemed, too final, too much like the mountain's way of silencing inconvenient questions. "Hush now," Ellie murmured, forcing her voice to remain steady as she repositioned her hands. "Fevered ramblings, child, just fevered ramblings." But even as she spoke these words of comfort, the girl's confession burrowed into her consciousness like a tick, drawing blood from old wounds she thought had healed. The baby crowned finally, a small head emerging, purple and still. With practiced efficiency, Ellie worked to clear the airway, to coax breath into tiny lungs that seemed reluctant to embrace life. When the infant's first cry pierced the night, sharp and indignant, both women wept with relief. The young mother recovered quickly after the birth, her fever breaking with the dawn. And when Ellie asked gently about her midnight ramblings, the girl's face went blank with confusion. "I don't remember much," she said, cradling her newborn daughter. "Just the pain, and feeling like I was drowning in it." With tearful gratitude, she thanked Ellie, offering a handful of coins that represented a fortune in these parts, but she provided no explanation for the dark words that had spilled from her lips in the throes of labor. Through the morning mist, Ellie walked home, her medical bag heavy on her shoulder, her mind churning with unwelcome thoughts. 6 months ago, she had returned to Grayson's Hollow, hoping to find peace in the work of bringing life into the world, to make some small difference in a community that desperately needed medical care. The mountain people were suspicious of outsiders, even one who had grown up among them before leaving for the city. But slowly, they had begun to trust her steady hands and gentle manner. 8 babies she had delivered since her return, broken bones and festering wounds she had tended, slowly building a practice that gave her purpose and a fragile sense of belonging. That Sunday, she sat in the weathered pews of Grayson's Hollow Baptist Church, trying to find solace in the familiar hymns and Reverend Hutchkins' earnest sermon about God's plan for his children. Small was the congregation, perhaps 40 souls scattered across the wooden benches, their faces weathered by hard lives and harder winters. To theirs, Ellie joined her voice in amazing grace, but the words felt hollow in her mouth. She found herself studying the faces around her, wondering what secrets they carried, what sins they whispered to God in the privacy of their prayers. Not among the congregation were the Blackwoods, she noticed, though she could not recall if they had ever been regular attendees, even before her departure for Charleston. After the service, she lingered in the churchyard, accepting kind words about her work from Mrs. Patterson, whose grandson she had helped deliver the previous month. The older woman's face was lined with genuine warmth. For a moment, Ellie felt the possibility of belonging, of finding her place in this insular community that had shaped her childhood. But even as she smiled and nodded at the compliments, part of her mind remained fixed on the laboring girl's fevered words, turning them over like stones in her pocket. 3 days later, while purchasing supplies at Thornton's general store, the stones began to form a pattern. She was examining a bolt of cotton cloth, calculating whether she could afford new bed linens, when she heard Mrs. Oakley's voice drop to a whisper behind the pickle barrels. "Saw Silas Blackwood in town yesterday," the woman was saying to her companion, Mrs. Bell. "First time in months. Looked thin as a rail, and those eyes of his." Visibly, she shuddered. "Like looking into a well at midnight." "Hush," Mrs. Bell replied, glancing nervously around the store. "You know better than to speak of them." I know, Mrs. Oakley said, "but it ain't natural, the way they live up there. 2 grown men, never married, never seen with women." Her voice dropped even lower. "My grandmother used to say there's a curse on that family, something unholy in their blood." "Your grandmother said a lot of things," Mrs. Bell countered, but her tone lacked conviction, and most of it was superstition and nonsense. "Maybe so," Mrs. Oakley conceded. "But explain to me why every woman who's ever gotten too curious about the Blackwood twins has ended up dead or disappeared. Your own cousin Rachel asked too many questions about them before she took that tumble down Copper Creek Falls. And don't even mention poor Sarah Collins. God rest her soul." At the mention of her mother's name, Ellie's hands tightened on the fabric, her knuckles going white against the blue cotton. Sarah Collins, who had fallen from Miller's Ravine on a foggy morning 7 years ago, her body broken on the rocks below. An accident, the sheriff had concluded, after a cursory investigation. A tragic accident that left a young woman orphaned and a community's questions buried with the dead. With hands that trembled slightly, Ellie paid for her supplies, exchanging pleasantries with old Mr. Thornton while her mind raced with implications she was not yet ready to face. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, her mother's voice seemed to whisper in the wind that stirred the dying leaves, warnings about families who turned inward, about bloodlines that twisted back on themselves like snakes eating their own tails. That night, she stood on her cabin's small porch and looked out at the dark mountains that surrounded the hollow, their peaks lost in low-hanging clouds that seemed to press down like the weight of accumulated secrets. Slowly, the realization came to her, like water seeping through stone, that the uncomfortable truths she felt compelled to seek might be far more monstrous than she had ever imagined, and that the pursuit of them would demand a price she might not be prepared to pay. Well did the mountain keep its secrets, but Ellie Mae Collins was her mother's daughter, and some questions, once asked, could not be unasked, no matter how dangerous the answers might prove to be. The musty air of the church basement made Ellie's nose itch as she carefully turned the yellowed pages of the baptismal records, her fingers tracing the faded ink entries that chronicled births and deaths spanning back to 1840. Reluctant, Reverend Hutchkins had been to grant her access to the old ledgers, claiming they were fragile and better left undisturbed, but her gentle persistence and mention of genealogical research for her medical practice had finally worn down his resistance. Now, in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, she studied the Blackwood family entries with growing unease, watching as a pattern emerged that made her stomach clench with recognition. For generations, the Blackwood lineage stretched back, but it was the repetition of names that first caught her attention. Silas, Merritt, Ezekiel, Ruth. Again and again, the same names appeared, father to son, mother to daughter, creating a family tree that seemed to spiral inward upon itself rather than branching outward like healthy growth. More disturbing still was the absence of marriage records for the Blackwood men. While other families in the Hollow showed clear documentation of unions, births, and deaths, the Blackwood entries were sparse and mysterious. Children appeared in the baptismal records without fathers listed, and an alarming number of infant deaths dotted their family history. Babies who had lived for days or weeks before succumbing to ailments recorded only as failure to thrive or left blank entirely. Into her own notebook, Ellie copied the information, her hand trembling slightly as she documented what appeared to be a systematic pattern of secrecy and tragedy spanning decades. 14 infant deaths in the past 30 years alone, all from the Blackwood homestead, all recorded without explanation. The current Silas and Merritt were listed as born in 1862 and 1864, respectively, but no mother was named, only delivered at home in Reverend Hutchkins' predecessor's careful script. When she finally emerged from the basement, squinting in the afternoon sunlight, Reverend Hutchkins was waiting for her with an expression of barely contained anxiety. "I hope you found what you were looking for, Miss Collins," he said, his voice tight with warning. Sometimes our family histories contain sorrows best left undisturbed. Sometimes they contain truths that need to be brought into the light, Ellie replied quietly, meeting his gaze with steady determination. The Reverend's face paled, and he turned away without another word. But she could feel his worried stare following her as she walked across the churchyard toward the path that led to Ida Mae Carpenter's cabin. Alone, Ida lived in a weathered shack at the edge of the Hollow. Her reputation as the keeper of local folklore and herbal wisdom made her a figure both respected and feared by the community. The old woman was nearly 70, her memory sharp as a blade despite her advancing years, and she had been her mother's friend before Sarah Collins met her untimely end. Ellie found her sitting on her porch, shelling beans with arthritic fingers that moved with practiced efficiency despite their gnarled appearance. "I've been expecting you," Ida Mae said without looking up from her work. "Soon as I heard you were back and asking questions, I knew you'd find your way to my door eventually. You got your mother's stubborn streak, child. God help you." Ellie settled herself on the porch steps, accepting the implied invitation. "Tell me about the Blackwoods, Ida Mae. Tell me what my mother knew." The old woman's hand stilled, bean spilling from her lap onto the warp boards of the porch. For a long moment, she stared out at the darkening forest, her eyes distant with memories that seemed to cause her physical pain. "Your mother was a good woman," she said finally. "Too good for this world, maybe." She saw things others chose to ignore, asked questions others were too scared to voice. Ida Mae's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She asked about the moon-eyed people, the families that turned inward when the world got too hard to bear. Asked about what happens when bloodlines get twisted back on themselves like rope in a knot. "What did you tell her?" "Same thing I'm telling you now. Some doors ought to stay closed. Some secrets are buried deep for good reason." Ida Mae's gnarled fingers picked up a bean, turning it over and over in her palm. "But she wouldn't listen, just like you won't listen. She went digging in places that ought to be left alone. And look what it got her. You think her death wasn't an accident?" It wasn't a question, and Ida's silence was answer enough. After several minutes, the old woman rose from her chair with a grunt of effort. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the dark interior of her cabin. When she returned, she carried a small wooden chest, its surface blackened with age and wear. "Your mother left this with me before she died. Made me promise to keep it safe until you came asking the right questions." Ellie's hands shook as she accepted the chest, feeling the weight of her mother's secrets pressing against her palms. Inside, wrapped in faded blue silk, lay a leather-bound journal filled with her mother's careful handwriting. As she turned the pages, Sarah Collins's voice seemed to speak across the years, documenting suspicions and observations that painted a picture of mounting horror. Entries about the Blackwood twins' unnatural closeness, about their isolation from the community, about the uncanny resemblance between the few children who had survived infancy on their property. Her mother had noted the pattern of infant deaths, the absence of women visitors, the way the twins seemed to exist in a world entirely of their own making. But it was the final entry, dated just 3 days before her mother's death, that made Ellie's blood run cold. "I have found proof of the terrible secret that haunts the Blackwood homestead. God forgive me, but I cannot unknow what I have learned. Tomorrow I go to Sheriff Brody with what I have discovered. If something happens to me, if I meet with an accident, let this journal stand as witness to the truth. The children buried on that property deserved better than the silence that surrounds their graves." That night, Ellie sat in her cabin, reading and rereading her mother's words, each page confirming her worst suspicions and raising new questions that made her stomach churn with dread. So absorbed was she in the journal that she almost missed the sound of footsteps on her porch, the creak of boards under someone's weight. When she looked up from the pages, Sheriff Brody's bulk filled her doorway, his face grim in the lamplight. "Miss Collins," he said, tipping his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Heard you've been asking a lot of questions lately, stirring up old troubles." "I'm researching my family history," Ellie replied carefully, closing the journal and placing her hands flat on the table. "Surely that's not a crime." "Depends on what kind of history you're digging up." Sheriff Brody stepped uninvited into her cabin, his presence filling the small space with menace. "Some things are better left buried, Miss Collins. Your mother learned that lesson too late. I'd hate to see you follow in her footsteps." The warning in his voice was unmistakable, and when he left, closing the door behind him with deliberate softness, Ellie felt as if she were drowning in the silence that followed. The vandalism came 2 nights later. Someone had smashed her medical supplies, scattered her instruments in the dirt, and painted a single word across her cabin wall in what looked like dried blood. "Leave." The message was clear, but instead of frightening her into submission, it only strengthened her resolve. Her mother had died for the truth she had uncovered, and Ellie would not let that sacrifice be in vain. As she cleaned up the destruction by lamplight, her mother's journal clutched against her chest, she made a promise to the darkness that pressed in around her small circle of light. She would finish what Sarah Collins had started, no matter the cost, no matter the danger that stalked her every step. The dead children buried in unmarked graves deserved a voice, and she would be that voice, even if it led her to the same fate that had claimed her mother on that foggy morning 7 years ago. Through dense forest, the path to the Blackwood homestead wound, where the canopy blocked most of the autumn sunlight, creating a perpetual twilight that seemed to swallow sound and movement alike. Tighter, Ellie clutched her medical bag as she climbed the narrow trail, her breath coming in short puffs in the October chill, every step taking her deeper into a world that felt increasingly removed from civilized society. A professional courtesy, she had told herself this visit was. Word had reached town that one of the Blackwood twins was gravely ill, and as the only trained medical practitioner for miles, she had a duty to offer assistance regardless of her personal suspicions. But the weight of her mother's journal in her bag told a different story, and with each footfall on the leaf-strewn path, she felt the pull of terrible knowledge drawing her toward a confrontation she was not sure she was prepared to face. Like a wound in the forest, the Blackwood cabin squatted in a clearing, its log walls darkened with age and neglect, the roof sagging under the weight of accumulated debris and despair. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cold, and the small garden plot was overgrown with weeds that had long since gone to seed. Complete and deliberate was the isolation, a fortress of solitude that had kept the outside world at bay for generations. With careful steps, Ellie approached the front door, noting the way the silence seemed to press against her eardrums, broken only by the distant cry of a crow somewhere in the darkening woods. Hollowly, her knock echoed through the cabin, and for a moment she thought no one would answer. Then the door creaked open to reveal Merritt Blackwood, though she barely recognized him from the few glimpses she had caught of him in town over the years. Gaunt to the point of appearing skeletal, he was, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to be consuming itself from within. His eyes, once the same pale blue as his brother's, were now sunken and fevered, burning with the intensity of someone who was wrestling with demons, both physical and spiritual. "Miss Collins," he whispered, his voice barely audible through cracked lips. I didn't expect. Why are you here?" "I heard you were ill," Ellie replied gently, holding up her medical bag. "I came to offer what help I could." Merritt's laugh was a bitter sound that seemed to scrape against his throat. "Help," he repeated, as if the word were foreign to him. "There's no help for what ails me, Miss Collins. No medicine for a soul that's been poisoned from birth." But he stepped aside to let her enter, and in that gesture, she saw the desperate hunger of someone who had been starved for human contact, for any voice other than the one that had whispered poison into his ears for 30 years. A testament to the madness that had taken root within these walls, the interior of the cabin was. Religious texts were scattered across every surface, their pages marked with underlines and annotations in multiple hands, verses about purity and bloodlines and God's chosen people highlighted in fading ink. From the rafters, crude crosses hung, carved from twisted branches and hung with strips of cloth that might once have been white but had yellowed with age and neglect. Thick was the air with the smell of unwashed bodies and something else, something sweet and sickening that made Ellie's stomach lurch with recognition. It was the smell of death, hovering just beneath the surface of the living world. Onto a chair that groaned under his slight weight, Merritt collapsed, his breathing labored and shallow. "She taught us," he began without preamble, his fevered eyes fixed on something Ellie could not see. "Mama taught us that we were special, chosen by God to keep his bloodline pure. She said the outside world was corrupted, that only we understood the true meaning of his word." His voice cracked, and tears began to streak down his hollow cheeks. "She married us when I turned 16 and Silas, 18. Had Reverend Mills perform the ceremony in secret, told him we were distant cousins from Kentucky, made us promise before God and her dying breath that we would never let outside blood taint our family. Like pus from an infected wound, the confession poured out of him, each word more horrifying than the last. He spoke of their mother's twisted interpretations of scripture, of the ceremony that had bound him to his brother in unholy matrimony, of the children that had been born from their union. Weak, sickly things that rarely survived their first winter. 11 babies, he whispered, his voice breaking completely. 11 little souls buried in the woods behind the cabin. Silas says they were blessed, returned to God's embrace before the world could corrupt them. But I know the truth. I see their faces in my dreams, Miss Collins. I hear their cries on the wind." Around her, Ellie felt the room spinning as the full horror of the situation crashed over her like a wave. The medical knowledge she had gained in Charleston catalogued the genetic consequences of such extreme inbreeding, the inevitable birth defects and early deaths that would result from such a union. But beyond the scientific understanding was a more primal revulsion, a recognition of evil so profound that it seemed to leach the warmth from her bones. "Where is Silas now?" she managed to ask, though part of her dreaded the answer. "Hunting," Merritt replied, wiping his nose with a shaking hand. "He'll be back soon. He doesn't like to leave me alone for long, says I might do something foolish." The words carried a weight of years of control and manipulation, and Ellie understood suddenly that Merritt was as much a victim as the children buried in those unmarked graves. Through her thoughts, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch cut like a blade, and both she and Merritt froze as the door swung open to reveal Silas Blackwood silhouetted against the dying light. Larger than his brother, he was, his frame still carrying the muscle of hard mountain living, but there was something in his posture that spoke of coiled violence barely held in check. His pale eye swept the room, taking in Ellie's presence with the calculating gaze of a predator assessing a threat. "What is this woman doing in our home, Merritt?" Silas asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. There was no surprise in his tone, only cold fury that grew more pronounced as his gaze fell on his brother's tear-stained face. "She came to help," Merritt whispered, shrinking back into his chair. "I was feeling poorly, and she came to spread lies and poison," Silas interrupted, stepping fully into the cabin and closing the door with deliberate slowness. "Just like her mother did, just like all the serpents who would corrupt God's garden with their filthy questions and accusations." His eyes fixed on Ellie with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Did you think we didn't know, Miss Collins? Did you think your midnight visits to old women, your church basement digging, would go unnoticed? This mountain keeps no secrets from those who belong to it." Ellie forced herself to remain calm, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "I came here as a medical professional, nothing more." "You came here as a harbinger of destruction," Silas replied, his voice taking on the cadence of a sermon. "But you will find no purchase for your lies here. Merritt and I are joined before God and man, sanctified by Scripture and blessed by purity of blood. We are the last remnant of his chosen people, and we will not be corrupted by your worldly poison." Unmistakable was the threat in his words, and as he moved closer, Ellie realized with crystalline clarity that she was looking into the face of madness given flesh. A man who would commit any atrocity to preserve the twisted reality his mother had built around them. The danger she had sensed from the beginning now had a name and a face, and she understood with terrifying certainty that she might not leave this cabin alive. Against her ribs, Ellie's heart hammered as she backed toward the cabin door, her medical bag clutched like a shield against her chest, while Silas Blackwood's pale eyes tracked her every movement with the predatory focus of a mountain cat stalking wounded prey. Between them, the weight of his threat hung in the faint air, and she could see in his face the same cold calculation that must have been the last thing her mother saw before her fatal tumble from Miller's Ravine. Without taking her gaze from his, she felt behind her for the door latch, her fingers trembling as they found the rough iron handle. "I should go," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady, despite the terror that threatened to choke her words. "Merritt needs rest, and I've imposed on your hospitality long enough." "Yes," Silas replied, his voice carrying the silky menace of a snake preparing to strike. "You should go. And you should remember that these mountains have a way of dealing with outsiders who overstep their bounds. My mother always said that God protects his chosen people from those who would do them harm." Veiled in religious language was the threat, but its meaning was crystal clear. And as Ellie finally managed to work the latch open, she heard Merritt's broken sob from somewhere behind his brother's imposing bulk. Out into the dying light of evening, she stumbled, her legs weak beneath her as she forced herself to walk rather than run down the forest path that led back to civilization. Only when she was certain she was beyond sight of the cabin did she allow herself to break into a desperate sprint, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in her haste to put distance between herself and the horror she had witnessed. Branches tore at her clothes and scratched her face, but she barely felt the physical pain through the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The confession she had heard, the twisted justification, the casual mention of 11 dead babies buried like unwanted pets in unmarked graves. It was worse than anything her mother's journal had prepared her to discover. By the time she reached Sheriff Brody's office in the heart of Grayson's Hollow, the sun had set completely, and the windows of the small building glowed with the warm light of kerosene lamps that seemed to promise safety and justice in a world gone mad. Without knocking, she burst through the door, her appearance so wild and disheveled that the sheriff looked up from his paperwork with genuine alarm. A large man in his 50s, he was, his belly straining against his vest, his thinning hair combed carefully over his scalp in a futile attempt to hide his advancing age. But his eyes, she had always noticed, were sharp with intelligence despite his folksy manner, and she had hoped that intelligence might extend to moral courage when faced with the truth she carried. "Sheriff Brody," she gasped, collapsing into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "I need to report a crime, multiple crimes, the most horrible." But he held up a meaty hand to silence her, his expression shifting from concern to something that looked disturbingly like resignation. "I know why you're here, Miss Collins," he said wearily. "And I know what you think you discovered up at the Blackwood place. But before you say another word, I want you to understand something about the way things work in these mountains." He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight, and studied her with eyes that held no surprise, only a deep and abiding sadness. "Some stones are better left unturned, some doors better left unopened. Your mother never learned that lesson, and look where it got her." Beneath her feet, Ellie felt the floor seem to shift as the implications of his words sank in. "You knew," she whispered. "All along, you knew what was happening up there." "I knew what folks whispered," he replied carefully. "I knew about the babies that didn't survive, about the way those boys lived up there like hermits. But knowing and proving are two different things entirely. And in a court of law, you need evidence, not the fevered confessions of a dying man or the gossip of old women." He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the dark streets of the Hollow. "This community has survived for over 100 years by minding its own business, Miss Collins. We don't poke our noses into affairs that don't concern us, and we don't go looking for trouble where it's been contained." "Contained?" Ellie's voice rose to a near shriek. 11 dead children is contained? A man married to his own brother is contained? What happened to justice, to protecting the innocent? Sheriff Brody turned back to face her, and in his eyes she saw not malice, but something worse, a weary acceptance of evil that had eaten away at his soul like acid. Justice is a luxury for places that can afford it, Miss Collins. We're simple mountain folk just trying to survive another winter. We can't fix everything that's broken in this world, and sometimes the best we can do is make sure the sickness doesn't spread. He moved toward the door, opening it in clear dismissal. I suggest you pack your bags and head back to Charleston, where educated folks like yourself belong. These mountains don't take kindly to outsiders stirring up old troubles. In a haze of disbelief and growing desperation, the walk back to her cabin passed. She had expected resistance, perhaps even skepticism, but the sheriff's casual dismissal of horrors that should have shocked any decent person to action left her feeling more alone than she had ever thought possible. The community she had hoped to serve, to heal, to be part of had revealed itself as complicit in the very evil she sought to expose. They knew about the Blackwoods' crimes, had always known, and their silence was not born of ignorance, but of deliberate choice. That night, sitting alone in her cabin with her mother's journal spread open on the kitchen table, Ellie felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her like a physical thing. The vandalism to her property, the sheriff's refusal to act, the community's closed ranks, it all pointed to the same inevitable conclusion that had claimed her mother's life 7 years earlier. Some truths were too dangerous to speak, some evils too deeply rooted to challenge without paying the ultimate price. But as she read through her mother's careful documentation once again, studying the meticulous notes and passionate observations that chronicled one woman's solitary battle against willful blindness, something shifted within her damaged spirit. A simple crime, Sarah Collins had not been investigating. She had been waging war against an entire system of corruption and complicity that stretched back generations. Not the random tragedy of a woman who asked the wrong questions was her death, but the calculated silencing of someone who threatened to expose the moral bankruptcy of an entire community. Like lightning, the realization struck Ellie, illuminating a storm-darkened landscape. This was not just about the Blackwood twins or their twisted union or even the 11 small graves hidden in the mountain forest. This was about her mother's memory, about finishing the work that had cost Sarah Collins her life, about refusing to let evil triumph simply because it was easier to look away than to face uncomfortable truths. For the first time since fleeing the Blackwood cabin, Ellie felt something other than despair, a cold, clean anger that burned away the paralysis of fear and replaced it with steely determination. She would not abandon her mission or flee back to Charleston with her tail between her legs. She would honor her mother's sacrifice by completing what Sarah Collins had died trying to accomplish. And if the community would not stand with her in the pursuit of justice, then she would stand alone, just as her mother had done in those final dangerous days before her fall from Miller's Ravine. Quietly, the transformation began, as most revolutions do, with conversations held in kitchens and on front porches where the mountain women gathered to shell beans and mend clothes while their children played in the autumn dust. From her confrontation with Sheriff Brody, Ellie had learned that direct accusations would only strengthen the community's walls of silence. So she chose a different path, one that honored both her medical training and her understanding of how secrets were passed between women in these isolated hollows. The homes of her patients she began visiting, not as an investigator seeking evidence, but as a healer concerned with the welfare of future generations. At Martha Hensley's cabin, while examining the woman's newest baby for signs of the croup that had been plaguing the hollow's children, Ellie spoke quietly about heredity and bloodlines, explaining in simple terms how certain traits passed from parent to child and why variety in bloodlines strengthened future generations. "It's like planting a garden," she said, cradling the healthy infant while Martha listened with growing attention. "If you plant the same seeds in the same soil year after year, the plants grow weak and sickly. But if you bring in seeds from different places, the garden flourishes." Never did she mention the Blackwoods by name, but her meaning was clear, and Martha's knowing nod told her the message had been received. Across the hollow, the pattern repeated itself as Ellie made her rounds, speaking to wives and mothers and grandmothers about the sacred duty of protecting children, about the moral cost of silence in the face of suffering, about the strength that came from women standing together against the darkness that men in power chose to ignore. She shared her knowledge of infant mortality and genetic disorders, painting a picture of unnecessary death that resonated with women who had buried too many babies and wondered why God seemed so cruel to some families while blessing others with healthy children. 3 weeks after her visit to the Blackwood homestead, the breakthrough came. Ellie was tending to young Rebecca Morrison, the woman whose fevered confession during labor had started this entire investigation, when Rebecca suddenly gripped her hand with desperate intensity. "Miss Collins," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the cabin door where her husband was chopping firewood. "That night when my baby was coming, the things I said, they weren't fever dreams. I remember now, clear as daylight. I seen them, the Blackwood boys down by Copper Creek 2 summers past. They were holding hands like sweethearts, and Merritt had his head on Silas's shoulder like a wife might do." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "It ain't natural, what they do up there. And if you're asking questions about dead babies and twisted bloodlines, well, maybe it's time somebody finally spoke the truth." Contagious, Rebecca's courage proved. Within days, other women began coming forward with their own long-held suspicions and carefully guarded observations. Mrs. Patterson admitted she had seen Silas purchasing women's clothing at Thornton's store years earlier, explaining it away as garments for a sick wife that everyone knew didn't exist. Old Mrs. Oakley shared her grandmother's stories about the previous generation of Blackwoods, tales of brothers who lived as man and wife and children who died in their cradles from ailments that had no name. Each confession added another stone to the foundation of evidence that Ellie was carefully building. But more importantly, each woman who spoke out weakened the community's collective agreement to remain silent. When Martha Hensley stood up during the women's prayer circle at Grayson's Hollow Baptist Church and declared in a voice that carried to every corner of the sanctuary, the tide truly turned. "We've been letting evil flourish in our midst while we hide behind pretty words about minding our own business," she said. "But evil that goes unchallenged grows stronger, and the blood of the innocent cries out for justice whether we want to hear it or not." Her words sparked a heated discussion that continued long after the prayer circle officially ended, with women who had spent decades avoiding difficult topics suddenly finding their voices and demanding that something be done. A delegation of determined mountain women, Sheriff Brody found himself facing on a cold November morning. Their faces were set with the kind of resolve that had tamed wilderness and survived countless hardships. They didn't come with evidence that would stand up in court, but they came with something more powerful, a united voice that could no longer be dismissed or intimidated into silence. "You'll ride up to that Blackwood place today," Martha Hensley told him with quiet authority, "or you'll find yourself facing questions at the next election that you won't want to answer." That afternoon, the sheriff rode out with 2 deputies, his reluctance evident in every line of his body, but his political survival instincts finally overcoming his preference for willful ignorance. What they found at the isolated homestead would haunt the Hollow for generations to come. Merritt Blackwood lay dead in his bed, his body already cold and wasted by the illness that had been consuming him from within. But it was the condition of the cabin that told the real story, scattered papers covered with religious justifications for unspeakable acts, a crude altar where twisted ceremonies had been performed, and most damning of all, a collection of infant clothing carefully preserved in a wooden chest, like relics of some unholy devotion. Nowhere to be found was Silas when they arrived, but smoke rising from the forest behind the cabin led them to a horrifying discovery. In a clearing where 11 small graves marked with crude wooden crosses bore witness to years of hidden tragedy, he had built a funeral pyre. The fire was already consuming what appeared to be the last of the Blackwood family's possessions. And as the sheriff and his deputies approached, they saw Silas standing in the flames, his arms outstretched like a man embracing salvation or damnation with equal fervor. He had chosen to burn rather than face the judgment of the outside world, taking with him the last vestige of a family curse that had poisoned the Hollow for generations. Properly marked and blessed were the graves by Reverend Hutchkins, who performed the ceremony with tears streaming down his face as he spoke words of comfort for children who had never known anything but suffering in their brief lives. To witness this final act of acknowledgement, the community gathered, their faces reflecting shame and sorrow for the years of willful blindness that had allowed such horrors to continue unchallenged. On the first Sunday of December, Ellie stood before the congregation of Grayson's Hollow Baptist Church, her voice steady as she addressed the assembled families who had finally been forced to confront the darkness in their midst. "We cannot change the past," she said, her words carrying across the small sanctuary with quiet authority. We cannot bring back the innocent lives that were lost or undo the suffering that silence allowed to continue. But we can choose to be better, to speak truth even when it's difficult, to protect the vulnerable even when it's inconvenient. She looked out at faces that would never again meet her eyes with the same warmth they once had, understanding that her pursuit of justice had cost her any hope of truly belonging in this community. But as she concluded her remarks and took her seat, she felt her mother's presence like a benediction, knowing that Sarah Collins's sacrifice had not been in vain, and that some victories, however bittersweet, were worth any price demanded by conscience and truth.